The Council's message arrived with exactly 48 hours attached to it. A binary star system, 3 habitable worlds, and a rogue planet on a collision trajectory that none of the system's 7 resident species had the technology to stop. The Council's verdict was simple. Prove your worth to remain in the coalition of developing species, or be reclassified as a protectorate and lose your seat at every future decision that affects you. Humanity had 48 hours to demonstrate independent capability. So did the other 6 species. Ambassador Keth Vrall read the directive twice in the Council observation deck, then looked at the human delegate standing beside her. Director Elena Vasquez was not looking at the directive. She was looking at the projection of the rogue planet's trajectory, doing math in her head that the display had not finished calculating yet. The Council had structured the test deliberately. 7 species, 7 worlds at risk in the binary system, though 3 of them were uninhabited research outposts and 4 were home to actual populations. Each species would be evaluated independently, resources allocated, solutions proposed, execution assessed. The clear implication, embedded in every line of the directive's formal language, was that each species was meant to solve its own piece of the crisis and demonstrate its own capability. Competition disguised as cooperation. Vrall had seen this pattern before. The Council liked tests that revealed character under pressure, and pressure revealed character most clearly when species believed they were being individually measured against each other. She expected humanity to focus on the human colony. Vasquez called an emergency briefing 11 minutes after receiving the directive. The briefing room filled with representatives from all 7 species within 20 minutes. This itself was unusual. Most species sent their own people to assess their own situation first, conferring with others only after their internal planning was underway. Vasquez had sent the invitation to everyone simultaneously. She stood at the head of the table and pulled up the full trajectory data. The rogue planet hits the binary system in 41 hours. We have 48 hours total per the Council's directive, which means 7 hours of planning before execution needs to begin. The Threnar representative, a tall being named Coordinator Mez, said, "The directive specifies independent demonstration of capability. Are you proposing a joint approach?" Vasquez said, "I am proposing we solve the actual problem first and worry about how the Council scores it second." The room was quiet for a moment. The Veth representative said, "That contradicts the test structure." Vasquez said, "The test structure assumes the worst possible outcome is failing to impress the Council." He paused. "The actual worst possible outcome is 4 populated worlds getting hit by a planet because we were too busy demonstrating our independent competence to combine our actual resources." She pulled up the trajectory data again. "Look at this, the rogue planet's mass and velocity. No single species in this room has propulsion technology sufficient to redirect it independently. Not humanity, not the Threnar, not anyone." The room studied the numbers. She continued, "But the Veth have gravitic manipulation technology that could nudge a smaller mass over a longer period. The Threnar have the fastest ships in this system, which means the shortest window to position equipment. The Carthani have mining infrastructure already established on the 3rd outpost world with material we could use to build a deflection array. And humanity has something none of you have mentioned yet." Coordinator Mez said, "What does humanity have?" Vasquez said, 40 years of orbital mechanics data on exactly this kind of trajectory problem. Because we have spent 4 decades cataloging near-Earth objects and building deflection contingencies we have never had to use. She pulled up a new file. I am not proposing we share resources because it is generous. I am proposing it because it is the only configuration that actually works within 41 hours. He paused. No single species solves this alone. All 7 of us combining what we each have might. The next 2 hours were the hardest of the planning phase. Not because the science was difficult, though it was difficult. Because every species in the room had spent their entire history of coalition membership being evaluated, ranked, and assessed against each other. And the instinct to protect proprietary technology, to hold back resources that might give a competitive advantage in future evaluations, ran deep. The Carthani representative, a cautious and methodical being named Director Olish, raised the concern first. If we share the mining infrastructure specifications, the VETH gain permanent knowledge of our extraction technology. This as a significant strategic disadvantage for any future resource negotiation. The room understood the validity of the concern immediately. Vasquez did not argue against it. You are right that sharing creates risk. He paused. I want to propose something instead of dismissing the concern. He pulled up a document. A formal technology sharing agreement, time limited to this crisis only, with all parties agreeing that any shared specifications are licensed for this single use and cannot be retained, copied, or applied to any other context without separate negotiation. Director Olish read the proposed agreement. This requires trust that the agreement will be honored after the crisis passes. Vasquez said yes, it does. She did not soften this. I cannot give you a guarantee beyond our word and a documented agreement that the Council itself will witness. He paused. What I can tell you is that 4 populated worlds are about to be hit by a planet, and the alternative to trusting each other for the next 41 hours is watching that happen while we protect information that will not matter if everyone we are protecting it from is dead. The room was silent. Coordinator Mez said quietly, she is not wrong. Director Olish looked at the trajectory data one more time. I will share the specifications, time limited as proposed. The plan that emerged over the following 3 hours required precision that no single species could have managed independently, exactly as Vasquez had argued. The Carthani mining infrastructure, repurposed within hours using specifications and labor pulled from across all 7 delegations, would construct a deflection array on the 3rd outpost world. The VETH gravitic technology would be integrated into that array, requiring VETH engineers to work directly alongside Carthani construction teams in a configuration that had never been attempted before. The Threnar fastest ships would carry the completed components to the necessary positioning points, a journey that needed to happen in under 6 hours across distances that would have taken human or Carthani vessels 3 times as long. And humanity's 4 decades of trajectory data would calculate the precise timing and angle of the deflection, accounting for the binary star system's complex gravitational interactions in a way that none of the other species' models had been built to handle, because none of them had needed to model exactly this kind of multi-body problem before. It was, Vasquez noted in the planning session, a plan that required every species in the room to be vulnerable to every other species' technology and timeline. It was also, by every calculation the combined team ran, the only plan that had better than even odds of working. The Council observers, watching from their own monitoring station, noted the formation of the joint plan with what the official record would later describe as significant interest. The 41-hour execution window began with the Carthani construction teams breaking ground on the deflection array. Vasquez did not return to focus on humanity's specific contribution after the planning was complete. She stayed in the Joint Coordination Center, working alongside representatives from all 7 species, troubleshooting problems as they emerged across every part of the plan rather than only the trajectory calculations she had originally offered. At hour 6, a problem emerged in the Veth gravitic integration that none of the Veth engineers could immediately solve. The system that connected their technology to the Carthani array kept producing calibration errors that threatened to delay the entire timeline. Vasquez found herself standing beside a Veth engineer named Sten, looking at error logs that neither of them had originally been responsible for managing. Sten said, "This is not your area of expertise." Vasquez said, "No. But 4 extra hands looking at a problem usually beats 2, even if 2 of the 4 do not fully understand what they are looking at yet." She spent 90 minutes learning enough about Veth gravitic calibration protocols to ask useful questions, and somewhere in that 90 minutes, working alongside Sten and 2 other engineers from species that were not her own, the calibration error was traced to an assumption about gravitational constant variance that the Veth equipment had never been tested against in a binary star configuration. It was ultimately a problem that Vasquez's trajectory data helped identify, even though the actual technology being calibrated belonged to a species she had met for the first time 11 hours earlier. The fix took another 40 minutes to implement. The timeline held. At hour 23, with 18 hours remaining before the rogue planet's projected impact, the Threnar ships began transporting the completed deflection components toward their positioning points. This was the moment the plan was most vulnerable. Lure in positioning, a miscalculation in timing. Any disruption during the transport phase would leave insufficient time to recalculate and execute an alternative approach. Vasquez had not slept in 23 hours. Neither had most of the Joint Coordination team. She found herself, during a brief pause while the Threnar ships were in transit, sitting beside Director Olish, both of them watching the same monitoring display. Olish said, "I did not expect this." Vasquez said, "Which part?" Olish said, "Any of it." He paused. "I expected your species to solve your own colony's exposure and present that solution to the Council as evidence of capability." He paused. "I did not expect you to spend the planning phase building a coalition that required trusting 6 other species with the only advantage you arrived with." Vasquez said, "The trajectory data was never going to save anyone by itself." He paused. "It needed your construction capability and the Veth's gravitic technology and the Threnar's transport speed." He paused. "Keeping it to ourselves would have demonstrated nothing except that we understood a problem we did not have the resources to solve." Olish said, "The Council's test was designed to evaluate species independently." Vasquez said, "I know." He paused. "I think the test was wrong about what worth means." Olish looked at her. "What does it mean in your assessment?" Vasquez thought about this for a moment, watching the monitoring display, the small icons representing Threnar ships carrying components built by Carthani hands and calibrated by Veth engineers, and positioned according to human calculations, racing against a deadline that none of them could have met alone. "I think worth is what you do when the test is designed to make you compete, and you recognize that the actual stakes are bigger than the test." Olish was quiet for a long moment. "Then my people will remember this." Vasquez said, "I hope all of us do." At hour 40, with 1 hour remaining before the rogue planet's projected impact, the deflection array activated. The room went silent. Vasquez stood between Sten and Olish and Coordinator Mez, all of them watching the trajectory display update in real time as the combined Veth gravitic technology, anchored in Carthani construction, and positioned through Threnar transport speed and calculated against human trajectory data, began exerting force on a mass that no single species technology could have moved alone. The change was small at first, a fraction of a degree, then slightly more, the rogue planet's projected path beginning to bend away from the trajectory that would have brought it through the binary system's populated worlds. It was not enough. Well, not yet. The array needed to sustain the force for the full duration to achieve the necessary deflection, and every species in the room understood that the next 40 minutes would determine whether 4 populated worlds survived, or whether the combined effort of 7 species working together for 41 hours would still fall short. Vasquez did not look away from the display. Around her, representatives from 6 other species did the same. The deflection completed with 11 minutes to spare. The rogue planet's adjusted trajectory carried it past the binary system entirely, missing every habitable world by a margin that the final calculations confirmed was safe with room to account for any residual error in the joint models. The room did not erupt into celebration immediately. For a long moment, everyone simply watched the confirmed trajectory display, processing what 41 hours had actually produced. Then Coordinator Mez said something in the Threnar language that the translation system rendered as an exclamation with no direct human equivalent, something between relief and disbelief, and the specific kind of joy that comes after sustained fear finally releases. The room broke into the closest thing to celebration that 7 species who had met as competitors 50 hours earlier could manage together, which turned out to be considerable. Vasquez found herself being embraced by Director Olish, who had spent the entire briefing 6 hours earlier expressing measured caution about sharing proprietary specifications, and was now holding her with an intensity that several human members of the team would later describe as surprisingly effusive for a species not generally known for physical demonstrativeness. Oh, she laughed. She had not laughed in over 40 hours. It felt strange and necessary in equal measure. The Council's formal assessment arrived 6 hours later, once all parties had rested and the immediate crisis response had stabilized into recovery operations. Vasquez read it in the same observation deck where she had first received the original directive. The assessment was longer than the original directive had been, which was itself unusual. It documented in careful detail what the Council's monitoring SIST. EMS had observed across the 41-hour execution window, the formation of the Joint Coalition within 2 hours of the directive's issuance, the technology sharing agreement, time-limited and witnessed, the integration of Veth, Carthani, Threnar, and human capabilities into a single coordinated response that none of the 7 species' individual proposals, submitted separately to the Council's monitoring station as a formality, would have achieved independently. The assessment noted that humanity's individual proposal, submitted alongside the others as the formal requirement specified, had been the shortest document in the batch. It contained a single page. It read, "Our individual capability assessment is attached as required. We believe the more relevant assessment is what we did with the 48 hours we were given, which was spend 41 of them building something 7 species could not have built separately, and the remaining 7 hours making sure that what we built actually worked. We do not believe worth is best demonstrated by solving a problem alone when solving it together was the better option available. If the Council's evaluation requires us to have prioritized independent demonstration over the survival of 4 populated worlds, we accept whatever consequence follows from that choice. We made it anyway." Ambassador Vral, reading the assessment alongside Vasquez, was quiet for a long moment after finishing the human submission. You knew this might cost you your coalition seat. Vasquez said, I knew it might. Vral said, and you proceeded regardless. Vasquez said, 4 worlds were at risk. He paused. I was not going to gamble 4 worlds' safety on the chance that the Council would appreciate independent competence over actual survival. Vral looked at the trajectory data one more time. The rogue planet now safely passed the binary system. The 4 populated worlds intact. The recovery operations already well underway across all the species who had spent 41 hours working alongside people they had met as strangers and competitors. The Council has not yet rendered its formal verdict on coalition status. Vasquez said, I know. Vral said, whatever they decide, I want you to know that 6 other species watched what your delegation chose to prioritize when given a test explicitly designed to reward isolation. He paused. That observation does not disappear regardless of the Council's formal ruling. Vasquez looked at her. Oh, thank you. Vral said, I am not offering comfort. He paused. I am stating a fact that I believe will matter considerably regardless of what the Council decides today. The Council's final ruling arrived 3 days later. It was, by coalition standards, unusually brief. It stated that humanity's coalition seat would be retained, not on the basis of the individual capability assessment the directive had originally requested, but on the basis of a newly created evaluation category that the Council's ruling described as demonstrated coalition leadership under crisis conditions. It further noted, in language that several Council historians would later describe as unprecedented in tone for a formal coalition ruling, that the binary system crisis had revealed a gap in the coalition's existing evaluation framework, one that measured species purely on independent capability without accounting for the value of coordinated capability across species lines. The ruling announced the formation of a new committee, tasked with revising future capability assessments to account for this gap, and noted that the committee's first members would include representatives from all 7 species who had participated in the binary system response. Vasquez was named to that committee. So was Director Olish, and Coordinator Mez and Sten, and representatives from the remaining 3 species who had spent 41 hours building something together that none of them had arrived expecting to build. The committee's first meeting was scheduled for the following month. Vasquez attended, along with the others, in a room that felt considerably less formal than the original observation deck, where the binary system crisis had first been announced. Director Olish, opening the meeting, said, I would like to propose we begin by examining what made the binary system response work before we attempt to formalize it into evaluation criteria. Vasquez said, I think that is the right place to start. Coordinator Mez said, where do you believe it actually started? Vasquez thought about this for a moment. It started when someone in the room decided that the test mattered less than the people the test was supposed to be protecting. The room was quiet for a moment. Sten said, that is a difficult thing to formalize into evaluation criteria. Vasquez said, I know. He paused. I think we should try anyway. The meeting continued for the rest of the day, the beginning of a process that would eventually reshape how the coalition of developing species evaluated the worth of its members. Built from a binary star system crisis that 7 species had faced together rather than separately, because one delegation had decided that 48 hours was better spent helping everyone prepare than proving anything alone. If this story gave you that feeling, the specific satisfaction of watching 7 species choose collaboration when the test was built to reward isolation, then this channel is exactly where you belong. Every week we bring you the best HFY science fiction. The stories that find what humanity actually is when the stakes are real and the easy path was never the right one. The species that spends its time helping everyone else prepare. The species that understands worth is not measured by what you protect alone, but by what you are willing to build together. Subscribe right now. Hit the bell. Share this story today with someone who needs to be reminded that the best response to a test designed to divide is sometimes simply refusing to let it. We are still here. We are still helping everyone else prepare. We are always still here. The committee's work in the months that followed was harder than any of them had anticipated. Formalizing what had happened in the binary system crisis into something the coalition's bureaucracy could actually apply consistently across future evaluations required a kind of precision that the original crisis response, born from urgency and instinct, had never needed. Vasquez spent the early sessions frustrated by how difficult it was to translate what had felt obvious in the moment into language that would hold up under formal review. Sten, the Veth engineer who had spent 90 minutes troubleshooting gravitic calibration alongside her during the crisis, raised the core difficulty in their third committee meeting. The Council's original evaluation framework measured things that could be measured: fleet capability, industrial output, technological sophistication. He paused. What you are describing, the choice to prioritize coalition over isolation, is not naturally quantifiable in the same way. Vasquez said, I know. He paused. But the alternative is leaving it unmeasured entirely, which means the next crisis gets evaluated under the same framework that nearly cost us 4 worlds, because everyone was too busy protecting proprietary advantages to combine resources in time. A coordinator, Mez, said, what would you propose measuring instead? Vasquez thought about this for a long moment. Not the willingness to cooperate in the abstract. He paused. The speed at which a species moves from individual assessment to collective action when collective action is objectively necessary. He paused. In the binary crisis, the math made the answer obvious within the first hour. The harder question is whether a species acts on that math quickly, or whether they spend valuable hours protecting position before finally agreeing to combine resources. Director Olish said, you are proposing we measure hesitation. Vasquez said, I am proposing we measure how long it takes a species to recognize that the test in front of them might be the wrong test. The room was quiet for a moment. Sten said that requires the evaluators to also recognize when a test is wrong. Vasquez said, yes. He paused. Which is why I think this committee needs to include people who have already lived through one of those moments, rather than only people designing evaluation criteria from theory. The committee adopted, after considerable debate over the following weeks, a framework that Vasquez had not fully anticipated when she first proposed measuring hesitation. They called it the Coalition Response Index, and rather than scoring individual species independently, it scored the speed and completeness with which any group of species facing a shared crisis moved toward combined action, with specific attention to which species initiated that movement and which species resisted it. It was imperfect. Every member of the committee acknowledged this openly in the framework's published documentation, a level of institutional honesty about a new evaluation system's limitations that the coalition bureaucracy had rarely demonstrated before. But it was, for the first time in the coalition's history, an attempt to measure something that mattered beyond what any single species could achieve alone. The first real test of the new framework came 8 months later, in a crisis that had nothing to do with rogue planets or binary star systems. A resource dispute between two species, the Carthani and a previously unencountered species called the Drenix, escalated rapidly over mining rights to an asteroid field that both claimed sat within their respective territorial boundaries. It was the kind of dispute that, under the old evaluation framework, would have been assessed purely on which species presented the stronger independent legal and technological claim. Under the new framework, the Council's monitoring systems instead tracked something different. How quickly did either species, or any third party, move toward a combined approach that served both claims without requiring either side to fully capitulate? Vasquez was not directly involved in this dispute. She watched it unfold through the coalition's monitoring reports, curious whether the framework her committee had built would actually function the way they had intended, or whether it would collapse under the pressure of a real dispute the way so many well-intentioned frameworks eventually did. It took the Carthani delegation 11 hours to propose a joint extraction agreement that would have been unthinkable under the old competitive evaluation model. An agreement that split extraction rights based on technological contribution rather than territorial claim, allowing both species to benefit from resources that neither could fully access without the other's mining technology. The Drenix delegation, unfamiliar with both the coalition's evaluation systems and the binary crisis that had inspired them, took considerably longer to recognize what was being offered. Director Olish, watching the same monitoring reports Vasquez was watching, found himself in the unusual position of explaining to a newly contacted species why a coalition member was offering to share resources rather than fight for exclusive claim. He sent Vasquez a message partway through the negotiation. He wrote, "I am explaining your framework to a species that has never heard of the binary crisis." He paused. It is a strange thing to explain why cooperation is the obviously correct choice to someone who has only ever operated under frameworks that rewarded the opposite. Vasquez wrote back, "How are they responding?" Olish wrote cautiously. He paused, "But they are listening." He paused again. "I believe they will accept the joint agreement, though it will take more convincing than it took us in the binary crisis because we had the immediate pressure of survival to clarify our thinking." He paused. "They do not yet have that pressure. They simply have the choice in front of them." Vasquez read this and thought about how much harder it was to choose cooperation without the forcing function of immediate catastrophe. She wrote back, "That is the real test in a way." He paused, choosing it when survival is not yet on the line. The Drenix delegation accepted the joint extraction agreement 19 hours after the initial proposal. It was not as fast as the binary crisis response had been. It was, by every metric the Coalition Response Index tracked, still significantly faster than any comparable resource dispute resolution in the Coalition's recorded history. Vasquez retired from active diplomatic service 14 years after the binary system crisis. In her final address to the Coalition's full assembly, representatives from 43 species now sitting in a chamber that had once held only the original 7, she spoke about what those 41 hours had taught her, and what the years since had taught her about trying to build something durable from a single moment of clarity under pressure. "When the Council gave us 48 hours to prove our worth, I do not think any of us in that room fully understood what we were actually being asked." He paused. "We assumed it meant prove your worth alone. We discovered with 11 minutes to spare that the only version of worth that actually mattered was what we were willing to build together when the alternative was watching people we had just met lose everything." She looked out at the assembly, the representatives of 43 species who had joined the coalition in the years since, many of whom had grown up under the Coalition Response Index without ever knowing the old framework it had replaced. "I do not believe humanity proved anything unique that day." He paused. "I believe we simply recognized, perhaps slightly faster than the rest of the room, that the test in front of us was the wrong test, and that recognizing a wrong test and refusing to let it determine your actions is available to any species willing to look honestly at what is actually at stake. The Coalition Response Index is imperfect. It has been revised 11 times since its original adoption, and it will likely be revised 11 more times in the years after I am gone. He paused. But it exists because 7 species, 48 hours, and a rogue planet taught us something about worth that no amount of individual capability assessment ever could. As she stepped back from the podium, the assembly applauded, representatives from 43 species standing together in a chamber built on the foundation of a single binary system crisis that none of them had been present for, but all of them now lived inside the consequences of. Vasquez thought walking out of the essay. Embly for the final time about Director Olish embracing her with an intensity she had not expected. About Sten working alongside her through 90 minutes of gravitic calibration neither of them had originally understood. About Coordinator Mez's exclamation with no direct human equivalent. Something between relief and disbelief, and the specific kind of joy that comes after sustained fear finally releases. She thought about 11 minutes to spare. She thought that was always enough. She thought it still is. If this story stayed with you, if the moment when 7 species stood together watching a trajectory display update in real time gave you exactly the feeling it was meant to give you, then this channel is exactly where you belong. Every week we bring you the best HFY science fiction. The stories that find what humanity actually is when the test is designed to divide, and the only right answer is refusing to let it. Subscribe right now. Hit the bell. Share this story today with someone who needs to be reminded that the best response to isolation is building something together anyway. We are still here. We are still helping everyone else prepare. We are always still here. There is a memorial on the third outpost world now. Not a large one. The Carthani who maintain the world's small permanent research station tend it carefully, but it was never designed to be grand. It marks the location where the original deflection array stood, the structure built in 11 hours by Carthani hands and Veth engineers, and powered by the combined effort of 7 species who had arrived as strangers and left 41 hours later as something else. The plaque is small. It lists no individual names. It reads simply, here 7 species chose to build together rather than compete alone. 4 worlds survived because of that choice. May we remember what worth actually means. Vasquez visited it once years after her retirement, traveling to the third outpost world specifically for that purpose, accompanied by Director Olish, who had also long since stepped back from active diplomatic service but had remained close friends with her in the years since the crisis that had brought them together. They stood at the plaque together, 2 old beings from 2 very different species, looking at a small marker on a research outpost that had once been the center of a crisis neither of them could have solved alone. Olash said, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had not called that briefing 11 minutes after receiving the directive?" Vasquez said, "Sometimes." Olash said, "What do you think would have happened?" Vasquez was quiet for a moment, looking at the plaque, at the careful Carthani stonework that had kept it pristine for over a decade. "I think we would have each retreated into our own assessment, tried to solve our own piece of the crisis independently." He paused. "I think the math would have caught up with all of us eventually, probably around hour 30 or 35, and we would have realized we needed each other's resources far too late to actually execute a combined plan in time." Olash said, "You think we would have failed?" Vasquez said, "I think 4 worlds would have been lost." He paused. "Not because any of us lacked capability, because we would have spent the hours we needed for execution instead spending them on the instinct to protect position first and cooperate only once cooperation became the only remaining option. Olesh nodded slowly. I have thought about this often in the years since. He paused. I was the one who raised the first objection, the mining specifications, the strategic disadvantage of sharing. Vasquez said, I remember. Olish said, I was not wrong in the narrow sense. Sharing those specifications did create exactly the disadvantage I described. He paused. The Veth have known how Karthani mining technology functions ever since, and that knowledge has occasionally complicated subsequent resource negotiations between our species. Vasquez said, do you regret it? Olish looked at the plaque for a long moment. No, he paused. I think I was right about the cost. I think you were right that the cost was worth paying. He paused. Those are not contradictory positions. I simply had not yet learned in that first conversation that there was a more important question than whether a cost existed. Vasquez said, what question? Olish said whether the cost was worth what it protected. He paused. 4 worlds were worth more than the strategic advantage I was trying to preserve. He paused. It took me watching the deflection array activate, watching that trajectory bend away from worlds full of people who would never know my name to understand that completely. Before that moment, I understood it only as an argument I had lost. Vasquez said, and after? Olish said, after I understood it as something I believed. They stood at the plaque for a while longer, the quiet R's. Search outpost around them, the binary stars overhead casting the particular double-shadowed light that the system was known for among those who had visited it. Vasquez said eventually, I am glad we built this committee, the Coalition Response Index, all of it. Olash said it is imperfect. Vasquez said everything durable starts imperfect. He paused. The important part is that it exists. That the next crisis, whatever it turns out to be, will not require 7 strangers to discover the same lesson from nothing the way we had to. Olash said, you think the lesson is permanent now, built into how the coalition operates. Vasquez considered this carefully, because she had learned over many years not to overstate what any single framework could guarantee. I think it is harder to forget now than it was before. He paused. I do not think any lesson is ever fully permanent. Species change, leadership changes, pressures shift, and old instincts toward isolation and self-protection are always available to return to, especially when fear is high and trust feels expensive. She looked at the plaque one more time. But we built something that makes remembering easier than forgetting. He paused. That is not permanence, but it is something durable enough to matter. Olish said that is enough. Vasquez said I think so too. They left the plaque standing in the quiet light of 2 suns, a small marker on a small outpost world, commemorating 48 hours that had once felt like the end of something, and had instead become the beginning of something neither of them, walking into that original briefing room as strangers, could have predicted they would spend the rest of their lives helping to build. If this story is still with you, if the image of a small plaque on a quiet outpost world, marking the place where 7 species chose to build together rather than compete, gave you exactly the feeling it was meant to give you, then this channel is exactly where you belong. Every week we bring you the best HFY science fiction, the stories that find what humanity actually is when the test is built to divide, and the only right answer is refusing to let it. Subscribe right now. Hit the bell. Share this story today with someone who needs the reminder that worth is not what you protect alone. It is what you are willing to build together when it matters most. We are still here. We are still helping everyone else prepare. We are always still here.